Perfect. Let's try that again. Hello and welcome to Jam Session Recording, still 207. My name is Danny Beaumont, and I'm a Principal Product Manager on the Adobe Muse team. Today is one of those days where I get to show you what the team has been working on for quite a long time. We released last night at midnight East Coast time the latest update to Adobe Muse, and this is the first jam session we've had since that time. So it's an opportunity for me to step you through. Let's see if I can fix a little bit of technical issues here real quick. To step you through the latest feature set for the product. So if you have not downloaded the release yet, totally fine. We're going to talk through the feature set. It's kind of good to get a heads up about what we've changed. If you have a lot of work that you've done in Muse, I want to talk to you about that. So it's a great place to start here with the jam session. If you are new to Muse, there are lots of resources available to you to better understand how the tool works. So if you just Google Adobe Release Notes, it's a great way for you to see some of the new capabilities that are available in Muse. I have some cheat sheet notes of my own that I'm going to rely on, but we are enumerating the changes that we've made in those release notes. We kind of roll over to my magical list here a little bit. In addition to uploading the new release, there's lots of supporting promotion material that has been made available as well. So the first is, it's been a long time in coming, but on the Muse microsite, so muse.adobe.com, the landing page is dedicated usually to show off the latest features for Adobe Muse. And this landing page actually gets updated about once a year, I've realized. And usually the way the world goes is we'll have a new interface designer on the team, and to cut their teeth and acclimate themselves to the product, we have them use Adobe Muse, test their discoverability with the app, and build out a landing page. This time around, I actually handed the task out to one of our users in the community. His name is Aaron Lawrence, and he uses Adobe Muse. He builds lots of prototypes for a designer-developer workflow in his world, but he is an extraordinary typographer. And so the landing page, to be clear, for the microsite is not necessarily a functioning web page in the traditional sense. It's more an opportunity to celebrate and show off some of the features in action. And this landing page is true to that truth. As you scroll down on the page, there are some jump spots here that use anchor tags to scroll. As I mentioned, Aaron is a beautiful typographer, and a lot of the typesetting that he's put here, again, in spirit of the celebration, is either SVG or an actual PNG image, but it does show off some of the capabilities with this new release. So as I scroll down on the page, one of the new capabilities that we have is we have rebuilt some of the native Powerhouse widgets in Adobe Muse to be fully responsive. So the biggest one, I think, of all of that is something known as a Composition Widget. And it is a widget that has something known as a trigger and a target. And we're going to dig into this a little bit today during this session. But that trigger can have, actually the target can have lots of things inside of it. So the reason why a Composition Widget can be so powerful is you could nest inside the target area SVG content. You could nest a states button, let's say, so a button that you actually, as a call to action to go somewhere else. You can nest other widgets like a menu widget. And as you work with these responsive widgets, you have the ability to, per breakpoint, control the pinning, the resize attributes, and the placement of your triggers and your targets. So again, just as a teaser here, or a celebration of that new functionality, as I drag the edge of the browser here, I'm actually jumping to a different breakpoint where I've had the ability to come in and resize this presentation widget, this trigger target widget. Notice as I get to the smallest breakpoint, I can even come in and move those targets to another location if I'd like to. So this is not using a traditional method where I might hide one version of the composition widget and show a different widget. This is the same widget across all of those breakpoints with different layout attributes defined. Next improvement is around contact forms. So contact forms now support a fluid behavior. If you've worked with responsive layouts and forms in the past, usually what we end up doing is you'll define a new breakpoint and you'll make sure that the form sits within the smallest side of that new breakpoint so as to make sure it doesn't ever get cut off. What I have the ability to do now is, for my phone layout, for example, have a single column contact form. If I press and drag out to more of a tablet class of devices, I can have a 2-column structure. I'll go a little bit further to that largest breakpoint, and now I have an even different design layout for desktop devices. So a real opportunity there. Now, we're going to get into this. We're going to break this down, as I mentioned, a little bit slowly. But you have the ability to take an old Muse document that you've built. Let's say you have a form on a page using an old document. You can open that up in the new version of Muse, and you do not need to throw away the contact form and start from scratch. You can take the fixed sized existing contact form and enable responsive behavior for that form. Kind of continuing down a little bit, we've also gone in and re-engineered the slideshow widget. So a slideshow widget is kind of more of a classic widget where it has a previous button, it can have a next button, and then you can place an image. So in the target area, I'm not able to add things like a states button or a menu. That's really reserved for the composition widget. A presentation widget is more of a classic slideshow behavior. And I have the ability to come in and define those certain attributes. Continuing on a little bit here, just a little bit of playfulness from Aaron Lawrence. So it's really just celebrating the new capabilities that we have. So this is on the landing page of muse.adobe.com. Another thing that I've done, I think that looking back historically at some of the other landing pages that have been around, that there's real value there. So this was, for some of you, you may really appreciate, this was kind of a real labor of love for a while. What I did is took the landing page from 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016, and I put it together into a single Muse document in an archive. Now, obviously, this traverses 5 years of Muse engineering. So reconciling all of those different situations into one document was pretty interesting. These are all examples, the first 3, of non-responsive websites that we've delivered in the past with their features, and the first the first deliverable of responsive that we put to the market a year ago, February. So kind of a fun, playful place to hang out. They're now linked at the footer of the area here. If I come on down, or come on back up to the top of the site, I'm going to move this lovely video out of the way. I have the other pages that are on the site. If you teach Muse, if you're new to Muse, if you want to really get your head around what's new with the tool, come on into the tutorials section. So last night we updated this tutorials area to really showcase individual videos that talk about the specific features that I'm going to show you today. So little 5-minute videos here that you can watch when you have time, if you'd like to. They're echoed down here as well. And as you scroll down towards the middle area of the tutorial section, I'll give you a trick here as well. If you ever wanted a shortcut here, you can go to a particular URL. So if you go to that particular URL, basically you can drive right to the starter designs. So the idea behind the starter designs is, with Muse, when you say file new, it's kind of a blank canvas. And it's difficult to really understand all of the capabilities that Muse offers, especially if you're new to the web and don't really even know what all the pieces are. So quite often, starting with a template or an existing website is a good way for a new user to get started. The Muse team by no means wants to go into the template business anytime soon. We really enjoy both widgets and templates being developed by users of the Muse application for end customers. And there are some terrific widget and template providers that we do work with that you probably know in the business. There's also a resources tab at the end of the microsite that outlines some of the bigger template and widget providers. We wanted to take these new elements, though, the widgets I've talked to you about, so composition, slideshow, and form widgets, and redo the starter designs that we've provided about 2 years ago. So these 4 starters are the standard set of starters that we deliver now. You are free to download them. They include not only the Muse document, but you can access the assets that are placed within that document. We went kind of old school just to make sure it worked everywhere in every case. So for example, if I go to the new exposure starter that was updated last night and click on the preview button here, you can take a look at this responsive version of the site. So as I move down here, for example, the slideshow that we're looking at here is now using the responsive slideshow feature. If I drag to a smaller breakpoint and jump to that breakpoint, I can jump to that same slideshow. So it's built out using the responsive feature set. And you're welcome to download these files, take a look at them, understand how we went about placing content and pinning content. If you scroll all the way to the bottom of the site, and I get this toolbar out of my way, there's a link to download any of the placed assets that are used there. So if you actually want to play with the source content, both Muse and placed images, we're giving you full access to all of that. The goal behind these starter designs is for brand new users to be able to come in and customize the design and publish it to the web really quickly to understand the full capabilities of Muse. We find that users that publish early on have a much easier time of staying with Muse and understanding its capabilities if we get to that publish area quickly. So the starter designs are there for you now and available in that tutorials area. And we look forward to any feedback that you have around these designs. Within the Muse application, it seems like every year Adobe as a whole kind of re-engineers a little bit of this. But if I were to come in and close out all my files, let's go ahead and do it. I think I can manage it without too much fuss here. So I'm going to close out all of my documents. You may have no recent files. That's fine if you've just opened up Muse, the new install. There's a tab here now, the Learn tab. And this is a great way to be able to access some of our Learn content. There's a direct link there now that takes you right to the starter designs here within the page. Should take you right exactly here, but we'll check on that. So those starter designs are there and available. We've gotten rid of a couple of them and added a new one. So Altura is a single page event site for kind of a corporate environment. My name is more of a portfolio. Java, as the Persians say, is a restaurant site, and Exposure is more of a photo-rich site. And they all have, as I mentioned, these new widgets in action and are a great way to learn a little bit as you work. Okay, I think that's some of the big points I wanted to make. Talked about the landing page and the historical, the refresh starter designs. I am going to continue to work on jam sessions. As those of you that know that attend these jam sessions, if you are on Facebook, you can add questions into the comment section there below. If you're on Zoom, you're welcome to put it in the Q&A. And as I proceed here, I'll continue to answer those questions. I am going to take next week off and take my youngest son to college, but then I will be back. So 2 weeks from now, I'm going to do the same session again. And the intent with that will be to review all of the new features once again and answer any questions that you may be having about the product. So let's go ahead and kick into using the tool. I'm going to open up Muse again, and I'll go ahead and go back to those starter files. So let's see if I'm lucky here. What I wanted to do is give you an example of opening up a legacy file, a file that was built before the new responsive widget feature set was implemented. And then I'm going to also work with one that's a little bit more advanced that I've gone in and actually changed it to adapt to the responsive feature set. So taking it from the top, one of the mantras, literal mantras for the team that develops Muse is kind of first do no harm. So we realize that I think as a web designer, there's kind of a few scenarios that you'll come up against as to when you open up an existing Muse file. If you had a client and the client hired you to build out a website, it's highly likely that you have already been paid to do that. I've got, yes, there we go. Ah, all right, that's just the way it's going to be today. Not what I wanted either. Ali Pordelli, your cookie queue is just going to haunt us. We'll go without video at this point. Don't go away. You have to stay. In the spirit of first do no harm, in the spirit of opening up an old file that may need to make a minor change to, if I had built out this version of my portfolio site for a client, and the client mentions that their email has changed, or their address has changed, or their CV, their Vita, their CV. I pushed this thing live at midnight Eastern Standard Time last night, so my brain is not going to be where it needs to be today. I'll tell you that up front. But if you wanted to make minor changes to an existing site, if you do not want to take advantage of the responsive feature set for widgets, that is fine. Just don't go in and start changing certain aspects of the widget. So let's say my client says, hey, I need to change my CV. I can go into that particular page and go on down and make changes to, let's say, the education section of that site. If I don't touch any of the widgets, they're not going to become responsive. So for example, if I come to the contact form, even though I've gone in and opened this up in a responsive version of Muse, this will not change. So you do not have to start to embrace and troubleshoot any of the responsive features for any of the widgets that you open up in the new release if you don't touch them, okay? If you look at this site that I had built, as I mentioned, it didn't have the responsive feature set. Personally, one of the things that I've struggled the most with is not having any sort of an ad rotator, any ability to rotate content that you can change on a per breakpoint basis. So for example, here on the landing page, before we had the responsive composition widget, I did put a slideshow widget here. And actually, this may be a composition widget. It is, but all I have is these 3 dots. And the truth is, I don't really have the ability to move a lot of the content within the target area. With the new feature set, I can do that. So let's go in and just take a look at how you can come. I'm a little torn because I'm going to keep an eye on time a little bit here, around how much we delve in and play with some of these bits. Let's start with the composition widget, but I'm going to jump to the finished version, probably just to be kind to my brain today. When I jump over to this second version of the site, I have, instead of just that simple composition widget, I have a more detailed widget in place here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and step out. I have 3 breakpoints on this design. I'm going to step to the largest breakpoint. And I do want to talk about this just a little bit. So when we first delivered Muse, we had basically a single breakpoint. So you had fixed width sites. You had the ability to create alternate layouts. So you could do a fixed width for a phone, a fixed width for a tablet class of devices, and a fixed for desktop. And we would use something known as viewport scaling to scale that content to a certain class of devices. But what we found is over time, the fact that there were so many devices. If you take my iPhone 7 Plus and you hold it up in portrait mode, it's a phone. If you turn it sideways, it's a tablet. Because these devices have such varied resolutions and sizes, I think there's over 750 different devices that have a browser and can view your website. It became impossible to really break them into those broad categories of devices. So what we did when we introduced responsive design is we gave you this idea where you can come in and have either fluid or fixed breakpoints. And when your design breaks, you add a new breakpoint. So we offered that, but without the fluid behavior of widgets, you were really limited. So if you wanted to, let's say, have a certain layout on each breakpoint, there were workarounds, but they were painful. So what I've done here is I've gone into the composition widget and I've broken it into its parts. So if I click once on the composition widget, Notice up here, we still have this pinning metaphor and fluid width metaphor. To be really honest, the Muse team, when they built out these responsive widgets, they found that it exposed a lot of the underlying logic that Muse is using as it previews content in the browser and as it renders that content in the browser. Muse is the only tool that I know of in the market that allows you as a designer to visually build what you want on a page and then ask Muse to render that content as responsive content that will work across all classes of supported browsers and platforms. Because it's a free-form design tool, it can be challenging as we start to get to some more complex scenarios. And I think that the world of fluid behavior and pinning is one that the engineering team, it will continue to work with the community to refine and make an easier user experience. In fact, I'm going to come in, I'm always a little rough the first time I demo some of these things. Really, especially when I'm light on sleep. All right, I'm going to move this guy out of the way a little bit. Let's look at just the default state of a composition widget. So I'm going to come to the widget library, and I'm going to select a composition widget, and I'll just bring in the blank widget, and I'm going to drop it on the canvas. So at the moment, out of the box, this will be a responsive widget. Notice some little nuances here. When I place that on the canvas, I can see, although it's grayed out, that it's set to be a fluid width object and that it's not pinned by default. If I click a second time, I can get to the target area of that widget. So here's the trigger and here's the target. When I click on that target, I have the ability to decide what is the behavior for that target element. Do I want it to be responsive in width or basically not height or width? Now, the nature of the composition widget is that it's not the slideshow. It is a container, and that container can be fluid width, but not necessarily fluid height. And this is where I'm going to create an exception. I'm going to try really hard not to make things too complicated for this introductory session, because I believe we can spend a full other jam session, and I promise you'll get one in just a few weeks, where we really delve into all of the scenarios with these powerful widgets. So a composition widget can have content within the target container that's set to be fluid height and width. I can have photos that I want to scale in height and width. If everything within this container is set to be fluid height and width, then the container will behave, it will respect its contents, and the overall container will scale appropriately. But in its most basic sense, when I place objects on the canvas, by default, don't pin anything. Just keep it unpinned. The Muse team has worked hard to just look at basic logic with objects and try to make it a little bit more intuitive. So if I, let's just do this, because I do want to dissect this a little bit basically. I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to go to a blank page. And that blank page is, as you can see, by default, it's a fluid width page, and it has a master that's got some navigation header and footer on that page. When I drop this guy on the page, and without having done anything to it, press and drag the edge of my browser, notice the default behaviors. So I have a widget that's responsive in its width. It's got that fluid width behavior for the target. The triggers are also set to be fluid width. So as I work, I can come in and make decisions. I may decide that the triggers should be more iconic, so fixed in their height and width. Chances are, if in the widget options I have edit together selected, the behavior will reflect that. But to be safe, I could come on in and select one of these, right-click and say, select same trigger, basically. And let's say I decided to make this more of a button. I could make it 30 pixels by 30 pixels and go ahead and round out my corners a good deal so I can give it some sort of a stroke. I'm working with something that's already pre-styled, so it's going to probably be pretty odd, and set the rounded corner radius pretty small, and then just tighten up, whoops, let's try that again. Tighten up the space between these objects and move it more towards center, okay? Having done that, I do not want these to be fluid in width any longer. So with them selected, I'm going to come to this drop down and make sure I set that to none. And then I'm going to test to see what the behavior is like. All right, I'm looking pretty good, but notice how my dots are starting to get closer together. This is where you're going to want to experiment with some of the pinning behaviors with these objects. And depending on how they are nested with one another, you'll set different controls. I can come to the overall widget and center it and experiment a little bit to see what happens. I'm still getting my moving dots a little bit there. I'll come into each of these dots. Let's come in and select the same. And interestingly enough, this is where life is going to be fun. I'm going to try to pin it to the left side of the overall container and take a look. That is going to give me a hard wire. Whenever you pin, you're basically saying do not be fluid in any way. Basically put a crowbar between the object and where it currently is. I'm going to go ahead and hit escape. And let's grab these objects one more time. Select same. I grab it in the right place. And I'll pin them to the center and take a look at that behavior as I work. So I'm getting what I would expect at this point. But it took some experimentation for me as a designer to do two things. One is figure out what I wanted, and two, figure out how Muse would behave with this object as I worked with it. So I think that as a designer, when you upgrade Muse, before you touch any of your legacy widgets, you're going to want to give yourself a little bit of time to experiment and make sure that changes that you make are going to be consistent with what you want in the design. Let's go back a little bit now and just take a look. I want to show you some of the behaviors that we've changed here in the design. So if I come into the, basically the Who Am I page here, I told you my brain's not really working, my story. So this is about the person that this portfolio is built out for. There's some good content here. I've got text that's here. I've got images. I've got 2 columns and such. One change that we've made to make the performance on the design canvas a little bit quicker is to change the way text within reflowing containers works. So notice I've got a text container here. As I press and drag, I'm getting some interesting behavior. So you'll all notice that the width of that text container is changing, right? It's becoming more narrow. But one thing that's not happening is the image below it is not pushing down. This is a design decision that the team made, and we specifically made it. This is where you need to have a little bit of empathy, because you now have on a page multiple breakpoints. Within each breakpoint, you have multiple widgets. Those widgets now have multiple components, and those components can have multiple nested widgets inside of them. It can cause performance issues as we're trying to render in the design canvas here to simulate the behavior on the web. So one way that we can speed up performance on the design canvas is to not calculate the height of a text container when you define it as fluid until you release the button having scrubbed to a new location. So as soon as I let go of the mouse here, notice that there's a slight bump and the image is moving lower. I'll go ahead and go a little bit further just to the edge of that breakpoint. Again, the width is going to change. When I release, it's going to bump the content down. So that's a different behavior than you've seen in the past. I think it was a good decision on the part of engineering, because it does allow them to speed up the behavior on the canvas as you go along. All right, let's go back to our composition widget a little bit and just talk a little bit more about pieces parts. So to be very honest, I am like you guys. I am not based where the India development team is. So I try to just crack open Muse and give it a try when I have beta builds. And I try to achieve the goals that I find out there in the market that average users need. So this is the first widget that I went about building. Ali Pordelli of Cookie.com had built these templates for us originally, and he worked with me again to rebuild these designs. And he's definitely amazing for me in my life, because he's got thousands of customers that have bought templates, and he's learned through the years what users think. This is where Adobe has so many customers. It's hard for someone like me to have as much experience as someone like Ollie did. But we wanted to try to show just the different types of content that you can have. An ad rotator tends to be something that you'll see on a web page, and its goal is to give you up-to-date information. So my kids' rowing site, for example, there'll always be like 3 or 4 announcements that I needed to put to the top of the page, but you don't want to take up all the time and space for those announcements. You do want an ad rotator to catch the eye of the viewer so that you're calling their attention to something that's important. So the nice part about using the composition widget in that way is that you can free form place any content that you want within that container. So if I go to my first trigger here, notice that I am my name, I've got some text, I've got text here. You'll notice that I've pinned this content differently. And again, I encourage you to just download this file and spend some time to familiarize yourself with it. So I decided that there's no way I want my name to ever wrap. That would be awful. So I went ahead and pinned that content. I'm sorry, I set it to be fixed in its reflow width. But notice that it's not pinned. I did not pin it within the container. Once again, the Muse team is using relative positioning and relative percentages to judge the placement of objects when you nest them inside of other objects using this implementation. I am is also set to be fixed. Designer is fixed in width, but below it I have a fluid text container so that as I resize this text is going to become more narrow, and if need be, the overall container will grow to embrace a much narrower text column. In the second trigger, I have something very different. So I've got, not that different, but the text is put in a very different position. Let's at least say that. So notice that I have text up here. I can place text wherever I want it to be. This is an example of a widget inside of a widget. So this is, no, it is not. This is a text frame. It could be, it could be a states button if it wanted to be, but it's not. It is simply a text button. Like I said, it's been a long night. If I come to the third target, again, to show just a variety of capabilities, I placed an SVG element in here. So this is scalable vector graphics. It will render at the resolution of the screen. It will remain proportional, both height and width. In this instance, I've got it set to be fixed or not scale. As I drag the edge of my browser, I can see the behaviors. Notice that I've got a background fill on the container. I'm controlling how that background fill scales, how it is pinned within that container. And I will jump now to the next breakpoint where things change. So in the second breakpoint, just showing off that triggers and targets can be in very different locations. I've got triggers to the bottom and targets towards the top. That same content is there, but I've set different text attributes for each of these elements, so I can change the point size. Notice that I have this unique text tool per breakpoint set, and I can control its placement for each of these objects. Notice that I've got my little SVG element here. Looks like it's kind of getting a little cropped off, so if I were to go back and fine tune, I might increase that or change its crop level. I have the ability to freely do that. If I jump to the smallest breakpoint, I have some pretty similar objects here, but it's set to work within a smaller class of devices. So anything from 700 pixels down to the smallest phone device at 320. And then the rest of the site continues. So for example, I've got elements that we've had in the site before. I have a state button. Inside the state button, I have a text frame. And this entire button is set to have 3 different layouts. I'm going to pause for a second because this is not supposed to be a monologue. I'm going to see if there are questions that have come up on Facebook Live or in the chat. You're welcome to throw those questions in. If I don't take it up right away, I will take it up to the end of this session. Kind of moving down. Looks like the world is good. I have a few comments. Okay, Juan Diego is saying that the update is not available in Argentina, and why is that? I'm not sure about that, but I will check with some support folks. Of course, somebody wants to call me at this very moment because I'm on my phone. Let's go back to Facebook. Julian wants a CMS. That's not going to happen in this release, Julian. But we have had some dialogues about dynamic data and how you inject those into Muse as a static website tool. I think it will remain an ongoing dialogue. There are some really amazing epiphanies around how you work with dynamic data, so maybe we need to swing back through another jam session. I'm steadfastly convinced that we should not build a CMS directly into Muse. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Eddie is saying why is Muse automatically converting my website? If I make an update, everything is placed on top of each other. So the question, Eddie, is did you touch any of the elements? You should be able to open up a legacy file directly in Muse and not see changes to that layout. And if you're not seeing that to be true, you need to let us know through the support forum. This is a major update for the tool. And I do believe we all are in the same boat. I'm in the same boat as well, although I probably can pick up the phone more than you can, as we look at how we take legacy older files in Muse and open it up in the new release and what that does to your design structure. So I would say keep us abreast of any issues that you see. The engineering, the test engineers are keeping an eye on anything that comes up. As I mentioned, we should first do no harm, which means you should be able to open up a legacy file and not have it change your design structure. Let's take a look at the next one, which is slideshows. So in the slideshow layout, let's try to we can play with this a little bit together. So I'm going to go to the older version of my name. So this is before the change. Let's say I wanted to convert this to a dynamic slideshow. So when we built this out 2 years ago, we did allow you to have a slideshow here on the side, but it's a pretty simple slideshow. There is a bit of a caption that's here, but it was really difficult to try to place the previous and next button in the lightbox. One thing I do want to stop and just keep reiterating is the complexity of the work that this engineering team is implementing is amazing to me. To be able to take a legacy widget and allow it to become fully responsive is amazing. I had assumed you would have to throw everything away and start over. In converting it over to its responsive behavior, there are now just really lovely controls, but you need to take some time to consider them. So let's say I wanted to come here and make this more of a responsive page. Let's just kind of dig in a little bit. I'm going to start with, let's see, I'm going to start by making this a responsive page. So let's see if this goes well for me. I'm going to show breakpoints. Notice that I have a static website here. I'm going to right click and I'll just come into my breakpoint properties. I'm going to make this a fluid width page. And I'm going to set it to about 1200 pixels by default. Okay, I now have my slideshow here. And I want to come in, I'd like to do a grid basically. I'd like it to be, 3 or 4 across in this largest breakpoint. So I'm going to experiment with that a little bit. So notice that I've got my thumbnails and then there's a thumbnail container. I'm going to just drag that out a bit further. Let's do this. I'm going to take advantage of this space a bit more. And I'm going to drag some of these objects off. Give myself a little room to play with that thumbnail container. Okay, that's pretty good. I have different attributes for how these objects are spaced. I can have 0 spacing. I can have some spacing for it. I want to kind of get to where I'm at 4 across in this layout. So I'm going to resize one thumbnail until I start to see that I have a 4 across layout. So now that I've done that, I want to come in and work with my lightbox for this breakpoint. So I've got this 4 across layout. Now you'll notice I'm starting with a single breakpoint. I always think it's a great idea to work as much as you can in your largest breakpoint before you come in and then add new breakpoints. Another behavior that the team has worked really hard on is taking content from a larger breakpoint, and when you add a smaller breakpoint, and intelligently, dynamically scaling that content so that it doesn't quite fall apart as much as it did in the previous build. So now that I've got this guy set here, I'm going to go to my lightbox attributes here. Let's go take a look at the settings that are set here by default. So I've got fit content proportionately. I'm going to go ahead. Yeah, I always get confused by these. So fit is good. My goodness, I like fill, fill and fill, which means that if it's not a perfect fit, it will trim some of the artwork off. I want to go ahead and set this to support Lightbox, which it already is doing. I've got previous, next, captions, close, and the thumbnails. Let's go ahead and get rid of captions for the moment. We'll stick with previous and next, and we'll keep that close button. If you're like me, it becomes kind of a bit of a hunting game to find out where these buttons are. They can be kind of mysterious, I've found. So I've come up with some pretty good tricks. Let's see if I can employ them. So I've got this guy here. I'm going to go to my assets, my layers panel, in fact, and I'm going to look at this widget. There's my slideshow. I've got a close box, next, and previous. So I'm going to go ahead and select the close box. Here's my trick of the day. Select it. Well, there we go. I can see where it is. So it's got a very simple X on it. Let's just make this. I'm not going to design this guy out really right now. Let's take a look. It's got a background fill that's at its original size. Let's go ahead and scale to fill. This may not end up being all that attractive, but as I mentioned, I don't want to dig too much into the fine details at the moment. I'm going to give this, in the spirit of not attractive, white background. And let me find my next button. There you go. So I'm just going to put this here. Probably make some of those same changes. We'll scale to fill, and we'll give it a white background. And let's go for our previous. There it is. Same, same. All right, in brief, as I'm working here, I now can intelligently decide how these items behave. So I've got my lightbox here. I may decide, and I give you a few examples of these, I may decide that I want previous and next to be here in the largest breakpoint, and I always like to stick close in the middle. So we can assume for a moment that I can't do this, right? Here, let's see. Assume for a moment this might be a reasonable layout. As I click on these objects, I can see some of their behaviors. So notice that this by default is set to not resize. I'm going to go ahead and change that to be responsive width and height. That'll allow me to dynamically resize within that breakpoint. For my previous and next buttons, I don't want them to resize at all. I'm going to set them to none. And I'm going to, by default, not really pin them to anything. I just want to see how this behavior works. So I'm going to preview in the browser and take a look at what we have so far while sipping coffee. Okay, got some funny things. My navigation is pinned on the page because remember this wasn't a responsive design, so we'll kind of ignore that for the moment. I'll click on my thumbnail and I've got my full screen, I've got my background, and I've got my previous and next buttons here. Now, if I resize my browser, I only have one breakpoint so far. Notice that the content remains centered. Notice that the distance is preserved pretty well between that full screen image and the previous and next button. So these are all kind of interesting. If I go and exaggerate it, there's going to come a time where I'm going to want to come in and add a new breakpoint, but I have the ability now to work within the confines of that breakpoint as I'm coming along. So let's say I decide I want to scrub to a certain point and add another breakpoint. I can come in now and resize. Now, one thing I probably could have, should have done here, let's check these guys. For this thumbnail, notice that by default, I'm going to get rid of that second breakpoint. By default, this is also set to fixed. Keep in mind, I'm going to just keep reiterating, if I were to have dragged the slideshow out onto the canvas using the new version of Muse, these probably would by default have responsive attributes set for them. Because I'm taking a legacy file and opening it up, Muse does not want to assume anything until you're ready to make it responsive. So I'll come in and select that thumbnail. We'll go ahead and select all of them for safekeeping here, and I'll set them to responsive width and height. And now as I scrub, notice that it's almost as though I'm scaling the entire page. It's dynamically resizing both the thumbnails and my hero image here for my lightbox. With that said, I can now come in and say, you know what, that's looking a little crowded and small. I want to come on in and go for maybe 2 across as I work, and then I can adjust. I may decide that for this other breakpoint, I want the controls to be up here towards the center at the top. So I continue to iterate and work with it in that manner. If I then jump over to the contact form, this contact form is not as much fun as the finished version. Ollie reworked this entire form. I can kind of show some of the capabilities with the legacy version, but it's a little more fun to go with the one that's been finished. So notice by default, nothing about this form is responsive. It's set to left pin and it's fixed in its height. I've just changed this to be a fluid width breakpoint. In fact, I'm just going to go wimpy on this a little bit. Let's just go on in and grab a new form, because that one is really designed kind of to be very limited and fixed. If I come on in and grab a form widget here, we'll just grab the detailed contact form. Some of the behaviors is probably what you would have expected when we first shipped responsive design. I'm with you. It just took a lot of work for us to get to that place. But I can come in and grab these form elements and just decide that they should be a side-by-side layout initially. And I can select each of these objects. So one thing that I obviously have not internalized is another new feature we have, which is called simple selection. So let's say I know I want to get this enter name field. Ordinarily, the way I would do that is to click once to select the widget, click a second time to select the form field, and click a third time to get into the text input area, let's say. Simple selection says that I can tunnel into complex objects by simply double clicking, so clicking rather quickly on the object. So if I come here and click 1, 2, it automatically tunnels me into that field, right? If I want to tunnel back out, I can still hit the escape key and step up levels, but I no longer have to just keep clicking and checking to see where I am in the hierarchy. So if I click 2 times and then make sure I select the same here, I'll want to set that to be responsive in its width. Notice what just happened there. I'm going to undo it because I want to call it out. So here I am innocently deciding I want to select my contact form to be responsive width. And I would suggest, because we're all a family, this is a jam session, we're supposed to talk to each other, that the engineering team is trying to make things more intuitive for users of a very powerful feature. So when I decide I want this to be fluid, and I go to the drop down and change it to responsive width, watch what happens to the pinning interface. It grays out and unpins, because the truth is that is the behavior that I need in order to make sure that this form behaves, unless I maybe didn't set it the right way. Let's see. I'm going to come on up. Let's see if I unpin this guy here. You know why. Everybody knows why, because Danny didn't get enough sleep, and this is a fixed breakpoint. So go on into breakpoint properties, 1200. It is now a fluid width site that I've kind of damaged by doing that a little bit. But case in point, if you've used Muse in the past, it didn't fall apart all that much for a pretty major change. And as I press and, oh, let's get my min width something reasonable here as well. I'm hurting it again. But notice as I come in, oh, it's just going to be mad at me. Hold on. I see that the chat is coming up, and I will look at that in just a second. Probably have to dissect this guy again. Let's see. All right, gotcha. All right, let's see where we are with questions. Yeah, Ollie said my breakpoint wasn't fluid. And so did Russell. Thanks, guys. I know I should have listened to you earlier. So I encourage you to play with them. I think that contact forms do behave quite well. If we go back to the finished version of this starter design, let's just see here. That is not what I want. Try this keep in touch. Still not the right one, guys. Let's just see. I'll go to the finished design. That will be kind to me. So just as an example of a form, I've got a simpler form. Again, just a simpler design that's here, not the black containers. And as I press and drag, notice that I'm choosing to have the submit button scale. You can decide that this should not be a resizable element. If it was a button, I can set it to not have fluid width. I get to a certain break point, and then that same contact form with the same elements has a new break point and the ability to work. As I get a little close for comfort, I get another breakpoint that allows me to jump those pieces together. Okay, I'm going to look now. Let's see what's going on from comments. Gavin is asking for the fix for today's update should be available now. So if you go to the Creative Cloud and look for your app updates, you'll see it there. As usual, you know, everybody's just still wanting new features. So drop down field and a date picker. We know we do not have that this time. We know about it. We have it on our roadmap. And we, yes, I think it's important. I continue to lobby for it. It is on the roadmap. But to be honest, getting to the other side of responsive widgets has been enormous for this team to take on. So it was the area of focus that we paid attention to. Let's see. So I think this is Eve. I did this wrong like 19 times when you were here with me last time, Eve. He's asking, will we have repeatable regions or content and in-browser editing? The answer is there's no changes to in-browser editing right now in our current implementation. So no, that is not in the latest version. Got your name right, but I got your feature request wrong. Sorry about that. Let's just keep going a little bit. Let me just see. I'm going to go back to my list a little bit. So the feature videos are there, the demo files are there. Everyone's homework assignment, while I go have a week off, is to download the starter designs and come up with questions that you have around its implementation. As I mentioned, I will probably in 2 weeks do a what's new session, although there's a good chance I will just jump to a deep dive session with the individual widgets. So I think for all of us, one of the biggest challenges with this release is that widgets are incredibly complex. Anyone can see that the power of a design like this, having multiple breakpoints, having widgets within that have their own unique layout, and setting the layout policy in a way on your design canvas that allows you to achieve what you want in the browser is a major undertaking, both for the engineering organization and for us as web designers. So I personally am going to continue to do everything I can to understand not necessarily the rules that the Muse team has implemented, but the rules that browsers use and rely on to render responsive content, and how to set the attributes on the design canvas to adhere to those. So we're down to 5 minutes left on this hour. I would say at this point, please go forth and download your new release. I'm actually going to do something bad that engineering might get mad at me about. If you, I don't know, here we go. Don't do this. And yeah, don't tell them who told you to do it. Let's say you do a lot of work in Muse and you are afraid to download the new release because you're not sure what it's going to do to your legacy content. Here's what I would suggest, okay? Before you download the newest release, go into, and I'm speaking from a Macintosh. For Windows, you'd have to check with peers because I'm not a Windows user. But in the application folder on your Macintosh, rename the version of Muse that you have, your older shipping version of Muse. Give it a different name. Okay, support is going to kill me for this, but I think it's fair. If you go to my application folder for a minute. Danny's gone rogue. I better go on vacation really quick after this. So notice that I have a couple of versions of Muse installed. I have an August release. I have what was the shipping release before that. What I did is I gave it a unique name. So whatever the default name is of Muse that you have on your system, just give it a different name. I put the word shipping in it because as of a week ago, it was the shipping instance. I named this, I named its folder, and I added it to my tray here, my dock on my Mac. Notice I've got 2 versions of Muse. I then went and ran the installer for the new version that's just shipped. And after I did that so that it didn't drive me mentally insane, I went in and gave that second version a name. So this one I called August versus the shipping version. This allows me to have 2 versions of Muse on my same machine. So it's not a beta version and a shipping version. I have 2 shipping versions of Muse on my machine. If you are scared about trying out the new features, rename your version of Muse before you run the installer and install the latest version. Then what you should do is go ahead and try the new release. Experiment with it, see how it does with your files. If you are happy, save it in that newer version and publish it to the web. If you find that there are issues, because I taught you this trick, you have to let us know what the issues are. Do not save over your original version. Go back to the shipping version of Muse that's on your machine and publish in that way while you let us know any issues that you found. So that's your trick. I'm going to get yelled at later, but I think that it's only fair with such a major update going out for those of us that use Muse every day to kind of have some options available. Okay. With that, I'm going to stop. I want to see you here in 2 weeks. I need feedback about the work that you've done with the new tool. We are a community. Russell's saying he thinks it's a fair ask. I think it's a fair ask too. I will defend it to my engineering colleagues. If you are madly in love with your preferences files, if you've got like perfect preference files and you're concerned, you may want to save your preferences into another folder or something, because I think you'll be fine, to be honest. I think Muse will create more than one preference instance in your folder. This is how we do it inside the team when we have to. So go experiment for 2 weeks. Please come back, give us feedback, use the pre-release forum, use the public forum. We have a terrific support team right now that are very responsive and have their ear to the ground. I think this is an incredibly powerful update, and we look to the community to give it a go and give us feedback about what you think we've done. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks. There's that cookie logo again.